Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Today we have the pleasure of sharing the second of two lectures by the poet Christopher Snook on that great 20th century poet, T.S. Eliot. Some of you will already be familiar with Christopher Snook's powerful, subtle, and sensitive mind from the previous podcast lecture on Eliot's Wasteland. Today, Snook brings his formidable powers to bear on Eliot's four quartets, much of it written during the air raids on London during the Second World War. The four quartets is unquestionably one of the great artistic achievements of the 20th century. Written amidst the bombing of the Second World War, you might say this poem constitutes a defense of this temporal life as worth defending. In it, Eliot articulates, amidst the difficulty and suffering of human life, something lasting and beautiful. You're about to hear a really masterful lecture on this magnificent poem, but I'd like to conclude this introduction with a poem by Christopher Snook himself, a poem that has moved me deeply and which I think is about something very similar to what the four quartets are about. This is Everything Wakes Up by Christopher Snook. There is a grave conspiracy between sleep and death, those little deaths each night that we call slumber, and those long sleeps at the end of days that we call death. So when she asked if the black dragonfly on the edge of the civic fountain was dead or only sleeping, in much the same way she might have asked if the waving man were drowning or the drowning man only waving, I could only recall this from years of sleep-like death overtaking me each night and death-like sleep claiming those I love. I could recall only this from the stillborn child at dawn and the vigil at bedsides and the quick, violent deaths and the slow, painful losses. I could recall only this when together we looked at the dragonfly, dark against the edge of the fountain, and she asked, still a child, is it dead or only sleeping? I recalled only this: everything wakes up. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
Before getting started, I know I'm mindful that this will be my last opportunity in a formal way, in this kind of manner of address, to thank you all so much again for the welcome that we've received this week. I also wanted to thank Dr. Bryson. I'm going to try this evening to think through our readings for this week alongside the topic, the kind of topic of thematic continuity for your studies this year. But it was thanks to Dr. Bryson that I discovered there was a W in front of the whole, which clarified for me to no end precisely what you were doing here. So I want to thank Dr. Bryson very much. So as I mentioned, thank you. And I'd like to think about our readings for this week, again, in relationship, hopefully, to the larger concept of the whole that you've been considering. And of course, even a cursory glance at this week's readings, from Eliot's Wasteland to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, suggests at the very least that wholeness of a literary text, wholeness of the political community, wholeness of philosophical vision, wholeness even of a personal psyche, these things are at the very least troubled for these authors. Eliot's bricolage, his collage work, I think makes the point very simply: these fragments I have shored against my ruins. Fragments, you'll have noted in your reading, against fragments, not against a whole. What's partial against what's partial. It is all, I think, fair to say that this is a far cry from the Gothic cathedral and the spirit of the medieval Summa. It's not even evocative of the transition that Alan raised yesterday between Descartes' second and third meditations, which one might argue, at least, is a kind of adumbration of the relationship between part and whole. As Alan noted yesterday, refusing what he called the high pass of meditation 3 leaves one in meditation 2, a thinking thing. And to be a thinking thing, as Descartes makes clear in the first meditation, is really only one step better, maybe, than madness. You may remember that kind of extraordinary moment in meditation 1 where he says, I'm about to undertake a process that makes me like the mad, those who think their heads are made of pottery, their bodies of pumpkin or of glass. It's kind of remarkable observation. So I've adopted a title for this lecture that I hope, in addition to the general theme that's been announced, and I hope it captures something of this kind of troubled relationship between part and whole. So the title is We Live in the Flicker. This is taken, some of you may recognize it, though you're remarkably attentive readers if you recognize this little phrase, but it's taken from Joseph Conrad's novel, which many of you will have read, The Heart of Darkness. And of course, the guttering flame or the precarious illumination is a not uncommon modernist image. Charles Baudelaire, one of the most important voices in the formation of the modernist aesthetic, considered by some an unsystematic Dante, captures the spirit of the flicker when he writes about the modern city and its fugitive beauty, the quote, its fugitive beauty. That is to say that beauty in the urban world of the late 19th and early 20th century is ephemeral, it is epiphanic, and it is gone, right? It's just like that. Eliot also captures a world in the half-light that seems to flicker. You may have noticed in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Prufrock says, I have seen my greatness flicker. Eliot captures this world of half-light in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and in The Wasteland. Each poem, as he writes elsewhere, lives, it seems, in what he calls in Hollow Men, the valley of dying stars. And in Beckett, the flicker appeared as well. Pozzo says, whose name means in Italian, the pit, they give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, flickers, then it's night once more. To borrow an image of Alan Hall's from some years ago, these are all, in a sense, songs of the modernist moment. They are less conclusive, I think, than other songs we might sing, but they are songs nonetheless. So this is a very long and roundabout way of framing the topic for this evening's lecture, T.S. Eliot and Dante. And what I would like to offer this evening is kind of brief introduction to thinking more deeply, or maybe continuing our introduction to Eliot's engagement with the most extraordinary of Italian poets, Dante. First, his engagement while he was still a banker working in London, then during his life as a publisher and public intellectual. I think Eliot's critical framing estimation of Dante, as well as his poetic reframings of key Dantean images, particularly in his late masterpiece, The Four Quartets, these things will be at the heart of the discussion. So I'm going to try to think about how Eliot relates to Dante in The Wasteland, then how Eliot relates to Dante 20 years later. And in the process, I want to suggest that, in part at least, this poetic conversation across centuries, and then in Eliot's life across decades, provides Eliot with a response to The Wasteland in much the same way that their proximity, the sense of kind of intellectual comradeship that Eliot discerned, allowed Eliot to frame the malaise of the modern world. So I'm hoping in this we'll glimpse what for Eliot lies, as I suggested on Monday, on the other side of despair. You may remember I quoted from his play, The Family Reunion, and interestingly, Eliot turned primarily to playwriting in the 30s, so was engaged in a kind of public form of art in a certain sense, quite different from his poetry. He asks, of course, there, where does one go in an age of insanity? And the response the play offers is simply somewhere on the other side of despair. I'm hoping we can maybe see what that other side looks like. And then I'll conclude by trying to meet the impossible task set by Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Bryson of summing up in some way your year, which I intuit, even as a newcomer, has been shaped to reference Beckett or to cite Beckett by what he calls the beauty of the way. and the goodness of the wayfarers. So the first part, there's only 3 parts, but each part I'll read the title of the section and a brief passage of poetry, and then move into the content. This is Dante according to Eliot, Dante, and then Dante, and then Dante. It's from the 4 Quartets. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error, the only hope or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. The association of T.S. Eliot and Dante in the popular imagination of poetry readers in the 20th century is almost impossible to overstate, so that the general sense that Eliot is a voice engaged with Dante's literary tradition is almost universally affirmed by his readers. Ezra Pound, for example, whom we met briefly on Monday, called Eliot the true Dantescan voice of his generation. The Nobel Prize Committee, he won the Nobel Prize in 1948, referred to Eliot as the latest born successor of Dante. And the extent to which Eliot's vision was shaped by his lifelong reading of Dante was acknowledged not only by all who read Eliot, but also by Eliot himself. And so in 1929, for example, he referred to Dante as, quote, the master for a poet writing today in any language. In 1950, Eliot would say without hesitation that after 40 years, I still regard Dante's poetry as the most persistent and the deepest influence upon my own verse. I think in some ways, no doubt this has been clear just from reading 2 of his poems this week. As has been suggested already this week, Eliot's reverence for Dante was in part the result of his conviction that the Italian poet emerged within the context of a European culture not yet caught up in the spasms of disintegration that for Eliot begins largely in the 16th century. This, of course, is the subject of tremendous contested scholarship, right? Tremendous contested scholarship. Is the 16th century moment of profound emancipation, or is it a moment of profound disintegration? Or is it perhaps both, right? Often yes and no are the right things to say to every important question, right? Though well aware of what Eliot himself calls the dissensions and the dirtiness of the medieval ages, Eliot nonetheless argues that the period's thought world was more or less integrated. Dante's own vernacular Italian, for example, was itself remarkably close in character to the universally available Latin that shaped civic, cultic, and philosophic reflection throughout the continent. By cultic, they are just mean religious. They're kind of religious world. Across national cultures at the same time, which were in fact in many ways far more diverse, rich, and riotous than in the modern age of the nation state with its homogenizing pressures, across national cultures there were also principles of a common life that made Europe, and Eliot's word, more or less one. This unity found its literary expression in a common poetic model, the allegory. Allegory itself, which depends on what Eliot calls concrete visual images that are productive of compound meanings, emerges in a cultural context where actual visions, literal visions, dreams, sightings, with their implicit set of correspondence between this world and another world, were altogether normative. Right? So it's helpful to think about allegory and your engagement with allegory and your reading of Dante, that it's actually in the context of a culture that recognizes as real the vision, right? The vision as a kind of divinely inspired revelation of correspondences between worlds. As Eliot writes, Dante's is a visual imagination. Visual in the sense that he lived in an age in which men still saw visions. It was a psychological habit, the trick of which we have forgotten. He continues, we have nothing but dreams now, and we have forgotten that seeing visions was a more significant, interesting, and disciplined kind of dreaming. we take it for granted that our dreams spring from below. Possibly the quality of our dreams suffers in consequence. For all of these reasons taken together, Eliot makes the very intriguing claim that Dante is not a more universal poet than someone like Shakespeare or Milton, but rather claims that he is an easier poet. The clear visual image which allegory demands gives both compression and percussiveness to Dante's poetry, and the more unified cultural context makes the local preoccupations of Dante somehow more naturally and easily universalized than those of his poetic descendants. Eliot does a very interesting thing in his early essays on Dante. He just notes the opening lines of the Inferno and juxtaposes them with the opening lines of Macbeth. And I think if you do this on your own, you'll see the possibility of translating Shakespeare, the significant quantity that would be lost, this sort of sense of a difference between what he calls the easiness of Dante and a kind of increased complexity in the world of Shakespeare. In a talk delivered in 1952, What Dante Means to Me, I should say delivered in 1950, but published in the Kenyon Journal in 1952, Eliot describes in three broad brushstrokes how specifically Dante influenced his work. So he becomes very specific. He begins that talk by noting the lessons he's learned from more contemporary poets while he was still young. So, for example, from Jules Laforgue and the French symbolists, whom he read sometime between 1900 and 1910, he learns the powerful possibilities of idiom. And he begins what will become a lifelong preoccupation with reanimating the English language, expanding its emotional comprehensiveness, and as he writes in the later work, The Four Quartets, purifying the dialect of the tribe. Some of you may have heard that phrase before. It's often pulled out of Eliot's poetic work, that the work of the poet is to purify, by which he seems to mean to amplify the dialect of the tribe of English speakers. From Baudelaire, much more importantly, I think, and of much more consequence for Eliot, Eliot says that he learned the poetic possibilities of the more sordid aspects of the modern metropolis. So he writes, in fact, the business of the poet is to make poetry out of the unexplored resources of the unpoetical. The poet was, in fact, committed, he says, by his profession to turn the unpoetical into poetry. So you might think of J. Alfred Prufrock as an ideal example, right, of the unpoetical being translated into poetry. Whether or not that is, in fact, a kind of work of restoration and rehabilitation is a question we're thinking about. There's a sense in which Prufrock, what's to love, right, about that guy. But there's another sense in which the taking up of Prufrock seems to be a strange kind of work of restoration on the part of Eliot in relationship to an unsavory individual. That's just to sort of frame the conversation. But from Dante, Eliot says that there are three particular things that he has learned. Firstly, he argues that Dante is the supreme poetic craftsman. So that's the first thing he learns, unrivaled by any other major European writer. So you might recall here simply that Eliot is pointing to the kinds of things that animate the structure of the comedy. It's terza rima, for example, which functions as both form and theological commentary. It's 100 cantos, for example, with the 1 plus 33, 33, and 33, and the poetic meaning that generates. It's difficulty, and it's differently colored, I should say, use of the same word, stars, to conclude each section of the comedy. For Eliot, Dante's attention to craft, this attention to minute particulars, to the good of the poem, is a moral lesson and not only a compositional one. Right? So attention to craft, he discovers with Dante, is actually a moral quality to be sought by the poet and in the poet. From this astoundingly complex and coherent structure, Eliot derives his second lesson from Dante, that the poet is servant and not master of their language. As Eliot writes, quote, to pass on to posterity one's own language, more highly developed, more refined, and more precise than it was before one wrote it, that is the highest possible achievement of the poet as poet. This refinement for Eliot means not just a refining of poetic sensibility, but a poetry so clear and distinct that it has consequences for the entire community, the entire linguistic community, from politicians to artists to railway porters, purifying again the dialect of the tribe. So for an example of this, I was trying to think of a very practical example, but you might think of the way that John Donne's poetry has become the source of normative features of the kind of linguistic idiom of English language speakers. So for example, we all say things like, no man is an island. We tend not to be overly attentive to the significance, but most of us who work in the English-speaking world would know that saying. The point, of course, for Eliot is that certain words become more percussive, more animated, more fulsome in their content and their meaning. Finally, he learns from Dante that the work of poetry is its expansion of the human emotional palette. I'll call it the emotional palette. That's not a great word, I don't think, but I'll just call it that. And so he notes the Divine Comedy, this is Eliot, expresses everything in the way of emotion. Between depravities, despair, and the beatific vision, everything that man is capable of experiencing. It is therefore a constant reminder to the poet of the obligation to explore, to find words for the inarticulate, to capture those feelings which people can hardly even feel because they have no words for them. To move into sight the complexity of human interiority, and to shape with words what has hitherto been unnameable, this is the great work for Eliot of the greatest poetry. I think here of Arnaud, the poet at the top of the Purgatorio, who leaps with joy into the refining fire of the lustful. Dante there producing for the reader an image for the felt sense of delight that can attend, if not the first moments of self-correction, then its more mature unfolding. Or one might think of Baudelaire and his fugitive beauty, which captures the quintessentially urban experience of epiphanic eruptions of the beautiful, both intensely felt and fleeting. So Baudelaire writes, to give you an example, a lightning flash and then night. Fleeting beauty, by whose glance I was suddenly reborn. Will I see you no more before eternity? Part two is simply called Dante in Eliot, the second part of our reflections this evening, From Fire, by Fire. So again, this is a relatively lengthy, not overly lengthy, but it's a bit of a lengthy quotation from Eliot's four quartets again, and from the final of the four quartets, Little Gidding. I'll be quoting almost exclusively from Little Gidding. This is the second stanza. Eliot writes, if you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from, if you came this way in Maytime, you would find the hedges white again, in May with voluptuary sweetness. It would be the same at the end of the journey if you came at night like a broken king. If you came by day not knowing what you came for, it would be the same when you leave the rough road and turn behind the pigsty to the dull facade and the tombstone, and what you thought you came for is only a shell, a husk of meaning, from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all. Either you had no purpose, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured and is altered in fulfillment. There are other places which are also the world's end. Some at the sea jaws, or over a dark lake, in a desert or a city, but this is the nearest in place and time. The world's end. Just want to kind of have you keep that in mind. We've had opportunity already this week to explore together Dantean themes in Eliot, from the unreal city in the wasteland with its denizens of the underworld, to Prufrock's Dantean Do I Dare, Do I Dare, Like James Joyce, Eliot's inspiration or aspiration is a kind of poetics of addition, right? A kind of accumulation. And so a close reading of either of these poems will reveal compound allusions to the Divine Comedy, many of them, of course, intentional, but others, I think, that emerge simply as the result of Eliot's structural commitment to the productive image. That is to say, I think many of the Dantean allusions in Eliot are, of course, absolutely intentional, but I think precisely the structural habits that Eliot is committed to produce in the reader a kind of expectation, right, that images will be increasingly productive. So one can find Dante where maybe in Eliot's own mind, Dante was not present to his conscious mind at all. Of course, for Eliot, as for most poets, that would just be normative, right? That there'd be things operative in their poetry, not intended by the writer. In a sense, Eliot's poetry then is meant to cultivate a kind of cognitive space, not unlike the cultural space that he associates with the Middle Ages, one in which allegory or forms of symbolic correspondence are a normative mode of apprehension. And so I think one of Eliot's concerns in the kind of technological world is that our modes of apprehension decrease just ever so slightly. That may or may not be true, but that would be his anxiety at least. Beckett's images, I think, are fishy in some ways compared to Eliot's. That is to say, if you grab at Beckett's images too aggressively, to dislocate them into meaning or to stabilize their content, they simply slip away, right? Like kind of grabbing on. I don't know if any of you go fishing. I'm from Nova Scotia. So if you grab onto a fish too hard, it just pops out of your hands, right? The way I think I would think of, if one were to use food analogies, to make the comparison, or fish are not only foods if you're vegan, I recognize. Eliot's images, I think, are more like making popcorn. That is to say, they are constant eruptions of additive meaning, right? There's always more, pop, 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 pop. So that is just to say, to borrow from Alan yesterday, Beckett and Eliot seem to do their mathematics in opposite directions, right? Subtraction and addition, subtraction, addition. What I'd like to do in this section of our time together is simply to offer a reading of a single textual borrowing from Dante that Eliot uses in two poems that are separated from one another by 2 decades. The first use appears in The Wasteland, and it will be very familiar to you. The second appears in the final section of Eliot's Four Quartets, a work that is very often seen as his most significant literary accomplishment, and which in no small part contributed to his being awarded the Nobel Prize within about 6 years of the publication of this work. Just as The Wasteland was written in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, so the Four Quartets were also composed in wartime. Eliot lived through World War II's London Blitz, and he reflects in the quartets, amongst many other things, on his volunteer service as a fire watchman, a night watchman. These latter poems, the Four Quartets, so there's 4 in the cycle, are an astonishing re-engagement and even a kind of rewriting of his earlier work, The Wasteland, something of which I think we'll see in just a moment. But principally, though, what I'd like to encourage us to do is simply to hold in our minds the earlier suggestion that Eliot is struggling to articulate in the Four Quartets what might lie on the other side of despair, right? If the topography of The Wasteland is well known, what is the topography of whatever is on the other side of that? The Wasteland concludes with a kind of descent, or perhaps an ascent, depending on how you read its final stanza. As you remember, I suggested on Monday that this is one of the most famous, but also most complex and frustrating and difficult final stanzas of any poem, I think, of the 20th century. There is a riotous and kind of symbolic final 11 lines that are a heightened reiteration of the larger themes of the poem itself, and a slightly looser of the poem itself, which itself includes a kind of looser pastiche, but the final 11 lines are a kind of heightened pastiche, right? Sticking together citation after citation after citation. In these last lines, just to remind us, we meet the wounded fisher king from the Grail stories, whose affliction is the principal cause of his land's suffering. In those medieval stories, it's suggested that in the person of the injured king, the land and the people are united in such a way that all suffer what he suffers. So the head is wounded, and so too is the people, right? His wound becomes their wound. You might hear, of course, certain resonances, obviously, with the Christian tradition. But the association only begins here. That is to say, the associations, I should say, we are immediately in those final 11 lines thrown into a kind of post-Babel linguistic and cultural heterogeneity, right? It just gets crazy. We have a child's folk song, we have Dante's Purgatorio, we have English drama. These fragments, as Eliot writes, I have shored against my ruins. What I'd like to suggest or explore is how we might understand in the wasteland the Dantean image in these last 11 lines that gets taken up again in the 4 quartets. Then, I'll read it in translation, then in the fire that refines, he hid. It appears in Italian, but I'm not going to try to read it. I don't want to embarrass myself. Then in the fire that refines, he hid. That's the line from the Purgatorio that appears. Purgatorio, Canto 26. The larger context for this appearance, for this fragment, I think is instructive. Just to give you sort of 7 lines, Dante is told in this conversation in the kind of cornice of the lustful, I am Arnaud, who going weep and sing. That's kind of wonderful. I weep and I sing. With grief, I see my former folly. With joy, I see the hoped-for day draw near. Now, by the power that conducts you to the summit of the stairway, I pray you, remember at time opportune my pain. Then in the fire that refines, he, Arnaud, hid. Eliot cites this poem to try to make sense of what this fragment might mean for us. He cites this poem between London Bridge is falling down. The appearance of the bridge, of course, draws forward an image from the first section of the poem. So one way to read this kind of final explosion at the end of the wasteland is that Eliot is actually drawing forward all of the themes of the poem and then compressing them. You might remember, as he says, he wants his images to be compressed, right? It's by concentration and compression that an image works poetically. So the appearance of the bridge draws forward the opening section of the poem in a kind of apocalyptic repositioning of the London commuters that we encounter in Burial of the Dead. The mediating form, that's a kind of an overly complex phrase, the mediating form for those commuters, the bridge, that carries them from one place to the next, is now collapsing. Dead already, the suggestion seems to be, they will soon, in the language of the poem, reach the farthest point of alienation, connecting nothing with nothing. Right? So what does it mean if you're dead already and then the bridge you're walking across falls, right? What does that actually mean? Well, cognitively, I think for Eliot, it's a kind of return of that image from earlier in the poem, that inability to connect. I can connect nothing with nothing, right? Of course, the point of bridges, the pontifex, is to connect. As you maybe will have thought about in thinking about Boethius. Immediately following the passage from Dante is an equally evocative summation of another theme in the wasteland. So we have before it London Bridge, then Dante, then following the line from Dante, "O swallow, swallow." This is meant to draw us back to the section of the poem called The Chess Game and the agonizing story of Philomel, the poem's poetic archetype of sexual violation. So these moments of calling forward wasteland themes would seem then to color our reading of Arnaud's brief appearance. Then he vanished into the fire that refines them. For the comedy, the encounter with Arnaud is an almost final moment for Dante of moral purification and the reordering of his disordered loves. And yet in the context of Eliot, it is impossible, I think, not to read Arnaud's joyful return into the fire as at the very least equivocal. It may be a moment, finally, of purgation in the context of the wasteland that promises some form of renewal. It may well be that. But it may also be a recapitulation of the poem's third section. To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. Right, then he hid himself in the fire. So having decontextualized the fragment, its significance becomes in some sense frazzled, right, or difficult to read. Does it attach to the eruption of redemptive possibilities in the wasteland, shanti, 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 at the very end of the poem? Or is it simply a kind of cyclical return from lust to lust, from an infernal burning to its recapitulation, burning, burning, burning? At least in my reading of The Wasteland, the poem itself is inconclusive. It moves, I think, in both directions, right? Both possibilities are made available to us in much the same way that post-war Europe's trajectory was entirely unclear. Old truths seemed harder to affirm. New truths were increasingly animated by a totalitarian impulse. Think of fascism in Italy and Germany, communism in Russia, Justin Trudeau in Canada. As I suggested on Monday, in the face of this, a reasonable, even if not entirely rational despair seems entirely understandable, right? In the face of this collapse that Eliot is tracking in The Wasteland. So I'd like to turn now just to thinking about how Eliot navigates this section of Dante in the poem Little Gidding. Little Gidding is the last of his 4 quartets, and there Eliot returns to Arnaud and the Purgatorio. But this time there is, to quote The Tempest or reference The Tempest, there's a kind of sea change in the way Eliot navigates this particular passage. Or if not a sea change, then at the very least a rethinking of the fire that brings into it the orbit of the question that we've repeated over and over again today: what lies on the other side of despair? Right? I think Eliot's going to rework the fire imagery with that question somehow in mind. I won't rehearse the entire content of this poem, though I just strongly encourage you, if you're able, to read all of the 4 quartets, or even just to read Little Gidding, but I think to read them as a whole is Eliot's intention. So I won't rehearse the entire content of the 4 quartets, other than to say it takes its name from a small quasi-monastic Anglican community from the early 1600s that was formed under the care of Nicholas Fair. Nicholas Fair is important particularly because it's through him that the poems of George Herbert came to the reading public. George Herbert and Fair were very close friends, and Herbert left the manuscript of his poems. If you know George Herbert's poetry, one of the most significant poet of the 17th century sacred poets, he left the manuscript with his friend Nicholas and said, if you think these will be of any benefit to souls, have them published, if not burn them. And Herbert himself died very young, in his early 30s. So that's where the title Little Gidding comes from, this sort of community. Eliot's ashes are in fact interred in the small church in Little Gidding, which included amongst its early members another Tom Eliot, oddly enough. Little Gidding begins the poem more or less with an evocation of what it might be like to walk to the parish church and to arrive at what Eliot calls the world's end. End there, I think, for Eliot, both as telos and purpose, but end possibly also in that sort of strangely unsettling and yet beautiful image that Alan shared with us yesterday from The Tempest, the globe and its dissolution. Section 4 of this poem, Little Gidding, is where I'd like to direct our attention, but it's important to note that its key images emerge earlier in this poem, the image of a flaming dove descending. The earlier image or use of this image of the dove is a perfect wasteland recalibration of the sacred as potentially threatening. The dove, of course, is the Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition, the Lord and giver of life, as the Nicene Creed states, But its earliest appearance in Eliot's poem, this particular poem, Little Gidding, conflates the spirit or the dove descending with a falling bomb, right? So it's set during the Blitz. The bomb is the dove that speaks with tongues of flame. But as we move further into the poem, this reversal moves in an opposite direction. We move towards the true dove. And so this is what I would like to quote this section of the poem and think about if you might just hold in your mind the fire imagery here. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error. The only hope or else despair lies in the choice of pyre or pyre to be redeemed from fire by fire, which we've heard already. And then he continues, who then devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove. We can only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. Suspire, just a word for breathe. You'll recognize this, I think, from Augustine's Confessions, Pondus meum amor meus, my weight is my love. Whithersoever I am moved by love. In his 4 quartets, Eliot expands in some sense the possibilities for love. In The Wasteland, there is some suggestion that habits of love, giving or sympathizing or obeying, are elusive, if not entirely drained of their vitality and of their potential for expression in the human community. But 20 years later, I think Eliot's vision has changed dramatically, as if mediated by Augustine's remarkable insight, my weight is my love, which also functions, of course, as the principle of motion for the pilgrim in the Divine Comedy, right? The weight that moves him to the bottom of the Inferno, the weight that being set on fire that moves him to the top of the Paradiso. They are loves in the Divine Comedy, which are the cause of his descent, and it's love's reformation that is the engine of his ascent. I say all of this simply because in this section of Little Gidding, Eliot takes up in some sense less equivocally the Dantean image of fire, placing side by side the infernal fires of the underworld in relation to the purifying fires of purgatory. As he writes, the only hope or else despair lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, consumed by fire or fire. The dove that descends here is, for those of you familiar with the narrative of the New Testament, and just to remind us again, the Pentecostal flame of love and new life poured out on the infant church in the book of Acts. But in some ways, quite apart from that specific content, the more fundamental image is the primacy of love itself in the human person, which both in its purification and in its desolation, in the form of hope or despair, requires of the person a death. The final desolation of love is, as you'll remember from Dante, it's being extinguished. That is one pyre, right? Because it's frozen. Its apotheosis is a kind of transhumanizing, to borrow from Dante, that is its other pyre. As we discover at the top of the Purgatorio, there is an intolerable shirt of flame, a wall of flame, that Dante himself, along with every other pilgrim, must pass through in order to attain the earthly paradise and continue their journey. And Dante describes the wall of fire as hotter than molten glass. This is the final purgation. So Eliot writes, just to say it again, it's the Wagnerian leitmotif. Where do we go in an age of insanity? Somewhere on the other side of despair. So what is the landscape then on the other side of despair? It seems to me that for Eliot, and I think this is kind of striking in a way, for Eliot, in some ways, the landscape on the other side of despair is not all that different from the landscape of the wasteland. Things do fall apart. Centers don't hold. The purgative fire and the fire of dissolution are orientations of the soul. They're not properties of the land. Eliot seems to suggest that directions or turnings, in the first case, hope itself, in the latter case, despair, is a kind of manifestation of what Kafka calls To Remind You from Monday, or the despair is a manifestation of what Kafka suggests early in the 20th century: there is endless hope in the world, but not for us. I don't want to expand too much on this theme in Eliot, in part because I think it might cause me to become overly speculative in ways that wouldn't be very helpful. But the theme, by theme, I mean this double movement of love, right? The sort of sense that love requires a death, either purgative towards hope or of despair towards dissolution. I don't want to expand on that too much because I don't want to be overly speculative. I don't want to be fact-checked. So I'm going to avoid that. But I will note that Eliot offers at the very end of Little Gidding, which is also the very end of the four quartets, an image of where the hopeful are moved by love. So he gives us an account. So if the wasteland topography remains the same, or the world is the world, right? So we're in the world. And if Eliot's argument in Little Gidding is that the topography from a certain perspective doesn't change, though, and there's another deep sense in which it does change, but from a certain sense, the topography doesn't change. If you're in the war, you're in the war. That's just what's happening. Bombs are falling. But if it's the case that for Eliot, the reorientation of the heart towards hope or away from despair, if that's the constitutive feature of fire or fire, what animates the fires, he does offer at the very end of the four quartets a kind of image of what it might mean to move towards hope. So he writes at the very end, you may be very familiar with these lines or have heard them before. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, unremembered gate when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between two waves of the sea, quick, now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. There's a lot to unpack in that stanza, but I'm just going to make just a couple of comments about it. Fire and rose are two of the primary images in the four quartets. And of course, rose, fire, one might think of Augustine and the animating spirit of love, but also of the Purgatorio, but also the rose, the celestial rose, the redeemed community. In this final stanza, Eliot orients the reader towards a vision of hope. And I'll just make two observations about it before concluding. The first is that for Eliot, hope interprets dissatisfaction as a recollection. This, I think, is in keeping with a great deal that you have read this year, especially perhaps Augustine. The world's disappointments for Augustine are subtle, or in many cases, not so subtle ways, that the world, in fact, points beyond itself, or we might say, I tend to want to think better, deeper into itself. For Eliot, the direction that hope faces is paradise. It's hard to catch because I've just read it out loud, so it's kind of hard to catch. But as we've just read, Eliot writes, the end of our exploring is to arrive where we began. Well, where's the beginning? For Eliot in this poem, the beginning is Eden, right? It's a utopia. Eliot makes this clear at the very start of Little Gidding when he asks, where is the summer, the unimaginable zero summer? Zero summer is such an amazing phrase. by which he means a kind of originary fecundity of the world. Where is the kind of first and primal summer, right? That I kind of intuit ought to be here for me, but I can't find it. Well, it might be in Savannah, I've discovered, but otherwise it's certainly not in Port Williams, Nova Scotia, let me tell you. But the content of that paradise, right, this paradise that he's orienting us towards, the content of that paradise is, I think, everything. As he writes, the voice of the hidden waterfall and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness. Astoundingly, I think Eliot is reconfiguring the tree that was the site in the story of the Garden of Good and Evil, the tree that was the site of love's dissolution, as the place of child's play. There are, I think, no doubt, many significations here, but to my mind, chief among them is not only an allusion to a restored innocence as the necessary fruit of hope, a kind of habit of good cheer and conviviality, but more fundamentally and directly, Eliot is making a remarkably Dantean claim about the nature of restoration. Even waywardness, he is suggesting, may be turned to good. So the tree that is the site of dissolution becomes the site of play. As Eliot's friend and mentor Charles Williams described it, to forgive is to say, what you intended for my evil will be for my good. That's what it is to forgive, what you intended as evil. So the intention is clear, right? You meant it, you were bad to me, will be used for my good. To frame this in terms that I've suggested before, one of the many miracles of The Tempest is the sense in which Miranda's forgiveness of Ferdinand in the chess game at its conclusion recapitulates the larger work of reconciliation that is the work of Prospero, and positions forgiveness not only as a spiritual good, but in some very fundamental sense as a political virtue. So that's a little getting, I have a feeling that maybe wasn't quite as clear as it could have been, but just to suggest the sort of transition of the use of the same image from Dante, the same moment, to be in the refining fire, and the way that Eliot repositions his reading of that, or opens up another possibility, not present, or at least not clearly present, in the wasteland. So I'm just going to try to sum up. And the sort of title or subtitle for this section, well, the title is Summing Up When You Think of the Goodness of the Way and the Beauty of the Wayfarers. It was an indication, I think, of Dr. Bryson's charity when we were first in touch by email, that he would suggest that I sum up in any way at all your year of study, even in a provisional sense, given that not only are you continuing to study and to learn and to think, obviously, but also that there'll be a much more fulsome summation of your experience in the time of your graduation, right? There'll be a much more fulsome summation of your time here. Alan, I think, offered, to my mind, the best possible summation yesterday. And despite my kind of predilection for T.S. Eliot, to my mind, Beckett also offered the best possible summation. That is to say, a good accounting of a day, or of a year, or of a life may simply be to ask if we have kept our appointments. But of course, if I only say this, the problem is that I will sound derivative, and I am already mostly derivative of my friends. Because I haven't managed to make it new, as Ezra Pound said we should. So I'm going to try to say something more than that, but I'm actually not going to get much further. But I'd like to try to say something about the concept of the whole in light of your work this year, and possibly in relation to the larger topic of education, but I think I actually don't quite get there. So we'll see. So I began this lecture with a suggestion that, at least for modernists, we live in the flicker. The modernist vision of a world in fragments is both in some respects unique to that movement's particular time and place, animated by particular concerns. But you'll know from your time here, it is certainly not entirely unique or unprecedented in the history of philosophy and literature. For some of the early modernists, there is a sense that the world of coherent wholes has receded entirely or been obliterated under the pressures of contemporary life. The more enervated of these modernists, as we saw on Monday, embraced with a kind of pathological glee the destruction as the promise or path of renewal, bore the only hygiene. Others, like Kafka, seem haunted by the idea of an absolute, both imposing itself, yet entirely inaccessible. It's present to memory somehow, but entirely inaccessible. If you read Kafka's Before the Law, for example, you'll see that in that very short story. But the fragmentary forms of these modernists, though produced under particular social circumstances, were not without precedent. So, for example, you've already thought about German Romanticism, and the German Romantics deployed the fragment, arguing that each fragment should be both a wholly collected thought and yet gesture towards the necessarily incomplete task of thinking. This is Friedrich Schlegel's argument, but as part of the Jena school of Romantics. Alan just yesterday noted Pascal's Pensées, another collection in the aphoristic style, that is to say in fragments, but we might add any number of earlier works, the essays of Michel de Montaigne, and so on, and so on, and so on, moving backwards, and so back, so back, so back. This is just to cite instances of the fragmentary in the past 500 years, the ones that I've named sort of significant instances, but they abound, of course, amongst the Stoics, amongst early Christian communities. One can think of all kinds of contexts. And well before the Common Era as well, lots of instances where the fragment is used as a poetic or philosophical form of recollection and thought. Within the larger intellectual and cultural tradition that you've been studying, which includes these fragmentary or partial texts, there is, it seems to me, a strange kind of, I'm trying to think of the best word, it's not a double movement, but there is a strange kind of tension or paradox. On the one hand, the texts like Plato's Republic or Thomas's Summa, even the Gothic cathedral, are apprehensions of a whole. Indeed, not entirely unlike the Romantics, that earlier tradition, if we go past the Romantics and back, presupposes that the part is constitutive of and even revelatory of a whole. This is perhaps most clear in the Divine Comedy or in the world of medieval architecture, where manifold articulation is a necessary precondition of wholeness. You might say that the whole for the medievals shows itself in the glory of multiplicity, and the difference of multiplicity properly distinguished unites, right? The sense in which that's kind of what I think is partly what's going on in the Middle Ages. If you think of the Summa, if you think of the Divine Comedy, if you think of Gothic architecture. And yet, of course, the tension lies in the fact that constitutive of many of these great works is a kind of built-in limitation, or we might better say a kind of built-in, this might be a positive way of describing it, a kind of built-in humility. That is a conviction that wholeness is both real, with respect, say, to the cosmos, or the human person, or the divine, but that this wholeness is not subject to our willful apprehension, but only available as gift. We see this, for example, in Dante, for whom his poetry must finally go silent in the consummate vision of the divine love. But we see it also in Aquinas, of course, who builds into his Summa at the very beginning the very principle which necessitates that it be left incomplete. As he writes, "For then only do we know God truly when we believe him to be above everything that it is possible for man to think about him." Right? He builds in the impossibility of the project right at the beginning. Likewise, we might say or note Monica and Augustine's vision in Book 9 of the Confessions, which resolves itself in silence, right? The language of heaven that moves into silence. And so to think about the whole is in one sense to think about the coherence of an argument, the coherence of a text, to think about a work of art as a whole, and to discern in them the relation of part to all. And yet, in another sense, to think about the whole is less a matter of mastery, it seems to me, than a matter of what I would like to call, this is a bizarre phrase, but I'd like to call a kind of bovine cogitation. That is to say, a kind of rumination oriented towards a revelation of truths or a completion otherwise unattainable. So the kind of an orienting towards and then waiting. Bovine cogitation, I should say. I'm willing to gift that to Ralston College as a slogan. This orientation, this kind of openness, this orientation is, of course, in some sense, what we bring to any attentive reading, right? A kind of spaciousness. But it may be, I think, a broader category than this and define an orientation to the world. One that's not passive, as Alan raised yesterday. What is the difference between waiting and doing nothing? What is the difference between wavering, as we talked about on Monday, and waiting? So this waiting is not, or this orientation is not, I don't think, passive, but is convinced that ultimate things must finally show themselves. They're not subject to us. So you're all linguists in a way that I am certainly not. And so you will know that tradition, and I've heard students speak about, and of course have spoken over the years with Stephen very often about the tradition. You will all know that tradition simply means the handing on. From that perspective, to engage the tradition studied at Ralston is in a much more fundamental sense to be traditioned. That is to say, to have handed on those things with which and by the light of which, even dim and flickering, we may live better and more humanely. The strangeness, it seems to me, of tradition is precisely this work of translation. That is to say that it is properly a noun, something over against us that we apprehend, we work hard, as Eliot says, to appropriate. But in another sense, it is much more fundamentally a verb. That is an active formation and shaping that is incomplete without us. That is to say, to be traditioned requires that you be here, right? Otherwise, there's no passing on. But it requires, of course, that your instructors be here, that the larger community be here, that there be a kind of apparatus in place. All of that is simply to say that if traditioning is an active formation and shaping, then in a fundamental sense, it is always incomplete without us. The tradition's telos is its being handed over. That is the telos of the tradition. It's being handed. But what is handed over is something that in its most profound and refined moment includes within it the principle of its own incompleteness, its own humility in the face of what can only be waited for, only prepared for. And so to study is, in some sense, to trim the wick. It is to light the lamp and to keep our appointments. Because at least in this argument, and I recognize this is a framing that is certainly subject to dispute, but this would be the way I think of this. Because what is waited for, the gift that comes, in a certain sense, unannounced, is what it has been a true joy to discover here these past days. That is to say, it was articulated already for us. That is, what do we wait for? I think it was articulated for us by Beckett. Estragon says, there are times when I wonder if it wouldn't be better for us to part. And Vladimir says, you wouldn't go far. And Estragon replies, that would be too bad, really too bad. Wouldn't it, Didi, be really too bad when you think of the beauty of the way and the goodness of the wayfarer?
You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode featured the second of two lectures given by Mr. Christopher Snook in the 2023-24 MA in the Humanities program here at Ralston College. The great Romantic poet Percy Shelley once described Dante's poetry as, quote, the bridge thrown over the stream of time, which unites the modern and the ancient world, end quote. Today's lecture on T.S. Eliot's engagement with Dante aptly demonstrates this remarkable ability of the Italian master to speak as eloquently and urgently to the present as he did to his medieval contemporaries, and of having a guide like Christopher Snook, who likewise can put ancient and modern voices in conversation with each other. It is only through that process of conversation between the past and the present, the living and the dead, that tradition, from the Latin tradere, to hand on, can continue. It's for this reason that the curriculum of Ralston College's MA in the Humanities program stretches from antiquity to modernity and traverses the disciplines of philosophy, literature, art, and architecture. It's why we begin the program on the Aegean, where students spend 2 full months studying ancient and modern Greek simultaneously, so that they might converse at one and the same time with the sages of antiquity and with the living men and women of contemporary Greece. And it is why, when our students come to Savannah, they will read Aeschylus and Shakespeare, Dante and Eliot, so that the ancient and the modern worlds might be knit together one to the other in the minds of our students, as they seek to realize in the concrete circumstances of their own lives the truths they have gleaned from those who came before them. If you'd like to join us on this intellectual adventure, I invite you too to apply to our Masters in the Humanities program. You can read all about it on our website at www.ralston.ac. Whether you're a future student or simply a fellow traveler, we're glad to have you with us. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.